As we said, the Stroke Safe Ambassador Program is giving talks to wide community groups throughout Australia. I think there's something like about 170 ambassadors around Australia now. And later on, if there's any groups that you would be interested in a talk, please get in touch with the Stroke Foundation and they can certainly arrange more talks. I should point out I'm not a medical expert, so if there's questions of a medical nature, I'll refer you to somewhere else. But if it's questions about stroke and coping with stroke afterwards, I'm sure I can answer that, and Karen can certainly answer any questions relating to care. She's probably been through as much of this as I have. So there's three things I want to cover, and I hope you take away from the talk. Firstly, a good understanding of what a stroke is and some of its impacts. Secondly, how to recognise a stroke in yourself or somebody else. And thirdly, how to minimise the risk of having a stroke yourself. So those are the three things I'll cover in this talk. So firstly, what is a stroke? A stroke is anything which affects the flow of blood to the brain. And of course, the brain affects almost all the functions in the body. So anything that impacts the flow of blood to the brain is going to have a massive impact on the body. And there are actually two different types of strokes, quite different in their mechanism. The first is an ischemic stroke, and that's where a blood clot lodges in the brain and prevents flow of blood to other parts of the brain. Now there are different types of ischemic strokes. That can either be a stroke that something that originates somewhere else in the body and flows to the brain and gets lodged in the brain, or it can be something which actually develops in the brain. So that's the one type of stroke. The second type of stroke is called a hemorrhagic stroke, or also known as an aneurysm. And that's where a blood vessel in the brain just gets thinner and thinner, and one day it just bursts. And then it puts blood throughout the brain and prevents the flow of blood through the brain. Now, actually, about 80 to 90% of strokes are ischemic strokes, so the hemorrhagic stroke is comparatively rare, but it's the one I know about because that's what happened to me about 4 years ago. So I'll say a little bit about my experience later, but basically I was perfectly fine. I was working away at home on a computer, and all of a sudden I had an incredible headache, unbelievably bad headache. And then that resulted in going to hospital, and blood clot in my, an aneurysm in my brain had burst, and I had to have an operation the next day to seal that, and that started a 6-month stay in hospital. So since then I've had a very good recovery, and so I'm a lot luckier than a lot of people. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There's another sort of stroke that's very important to know about, and that's called a TIA, or a transient ischemic attack. And that's the same as an ischemic stroke, but it's where a blood clot lodges in the brain and then clears itself within a 24-hour period. Now, the important thing to know about a TIA is it is a stroke, and it needs to be treated like a stroke and with the same attention after it. And also that a TIA is very often a precursor to a full-blown stroke. So if you have a TIA, and a lot of people have one of these, either recognise it or don't recognise it and think, oh, it went away, I don't need to worry about it. And what they're doing is putting themselves at risk of having a full-blown stroke at a later date. So if you experience one of these, and I'll talk about the symptoms of a stroke later on, but if you experience one of these, it's very important to get medical treatment straight away, let the medical experts decide whether it's something that needs to be treated or not. So this slide's a little bit hard to read, so don't worry about the writing on it. But the key message is that a stroke can impact almost any part of the brain. And of course, different parts of the brain impact different parts of the body. And so depending on what part of the brain is impacted, it can have a different effect on different parts of the body. And there are a very wide range of impacts that stroke can have on the body. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it can impact virtually every function in the brain. And sometimes, if you're lucky, some of the effects will go away over time, and sometimes it's permanent. But so what are some of the impacts of a stroke? Firstly, mobility. It can have a devastating impact on mobility. In my case, I was completely paralysed down one side, so I couldn't even roll over in bed for several months. But over time, I managed to get back and learn how to walk. 3 things I wanted in hospital was I wanted to be able to walk, I wanted to be able to go up and down stairs because all our bathrooms were upstairs, and thirdly, I wanted to be able to drive a car. And fortunately, in my case, by the time I left hospital, I could do all 3. So we didn't have to get a new house just because our bedrooms and bathrooms are upstairs. But there's a massive impact on people if you can't get around. I was in a wheelchair for several months even after I left hospital, but that managed to get rid of that. daily activities. It can have a massive impact on virtually every aspect of your life. Incontinence problems, feeding yourself, showering yourself, getting around, work. In my case, I didn't go back to work after the stroke, and so that means, obviously a massive impact on your lifestyle and, things like that. Relationships and family, can have a massive impact on family relationships. I know one person, for example, who for the first couple of weeks after his stroke, he wasn't even allowed to recognise his own wife. He could recognise his kids, but he couldn't recognise his wife. So you can imagine what that does to family relationships. And, some people can change their personality. Quiet people can become very vocal, vocal people can become very quiet. So these, once again, people getting used to these massive changes in their body. Emotional changes. Depression is a very common after effect after a stroke, often as a result of some of these other factors. So if people's life changes, if they can't drive a car, if they can't go to work, if they have hobbies that they used to do, they can't do anymore. These are obviously massive impacts on people that need time to adjust. And people mostly do adjust over a period of time, but the impacts can be quite substantial. Psychological impacts, as I said, it can change people's psychology. They can become very depressed, and that takes a lot of time to get over. The good news really in this is that most people, initially it can be quite significant, but usually over the first 6 to 12 months, people do recover a fair bit of function, if you're lucky. It's not always the case that you recover the functions back. In many cases, you're left with some residual impact. But people do often get back a lot of the functions that they lost immediately after the stroke. So it's not all bad news. If you with a lot of work, usually it takes a lot of work with physiotherapists and OTs and other professionals, but with that help, it's quite possible to get back a lot of those functions. So some basic facts about stroke. Stroke is actually the second biggest killer in Australia after heart attack, and it's a leading cause of disability in the Australian community. A lot of people don't realise just how prevalent stroke is in our community. Something like 1 person in 6 will have a stroke in their lifetime. So if you look around in this room, 200 people, that's a lot of people that are going to experience a stroke over their lifetime. As I said, the impacts are going to be quite different in different people, but it's going to impact on a lot of people. And if you look at beyond that, the number of people who are caring for other people with strokes, it means that most of us in our lifetime are going to have to deal with a stroke either in ourselves or in a close family friend or relative. So it's something we all need to know about. Not just older people, but in fact younger people need to understand about strokes as well. Somebody in Australia has a stroke roughly every 10 minutes. So in other words, during my presentation, that's something like 2 people in Australia are going to suffer a stroke. And that's a lot of people when you look at it over a year. Stroke actually kills more women than breast cancer, and it kills more men than prostate cancer. Now, this is a fact I didn't know until I found out a bit more about stroke. But we hear a lot about breast cancer and prostate cancer, quite correctly. But stroke is also something massively important to the community, and we need to understand that, understand its impacts. And we think of stroke as impacting older people, and that's certainly the case. The risk of having a stroke increases with age, but something like 30% of stroke survivors are less than 65. In other words, are in working age. So it's a massive impact on the workforce with people having strokes. And sometimes people can go back to work. In many cases, they can't work or they have to change their work. In my case, for example, I was working, as was said in the introduction, I was working in Asia on telecommunication projects around Asia with a lot of travel overseas. And after it was about 12 months before I would have been able to go back to that. And I ended up not going back to work, so I haven't worked since then. I found a lot of other things to occupy my time, but I haven't gone back to work. But unfortunately, I was at a stage of life when I could do that without too many impacts. Whereas if I'd been much younger, it would have had a massive impact on our life and our lifestyle. But once again, people can find other things to do, and they can find productive ways of contributing to the community. So now to move on to some facts about stroke. The good news is that many strokes are preventable. There are some factors that affect stroke which are not preventable, and some of these include age. As I said, the older you are, the more chance of having a stroke. Men tend to have more strokes than women, and some races tend to have higher percentage of strokes than Caucasian races. So some Asian races, Middle East races, Torres Strait Islanders, Aboriginals tend to have a higher rate of stroke than Caucasians. Also in family, if you have a lot of history of stroke in your family, even though stroke, they say, is not directly a heritable factor, it's definitely a higher proportion. If you have people in your family with stroke, your chances of having a stroke are higher yourself. So those are some of the things that really we can't control. But there are some things we can control and affect our stroke risk. Now the good news here is that really this is the previous talk given again. The main thing you can do to lower your risk of stroke is to lower your blood pressure. So the recommendation is to know your numbers, go to the doctor, have your blood pressure measured, leave it up to the doctor to say what action needs to be taken, whether it's lifestyle changes, whether it's medication. It's only the doctor who can make those recommendations. But all the things that were said very clearly in the previous talk apply here. So all the things to reduce our blood pressure, avoiding smoking, reducing our blood cholesterol level, controlling diabetes, making healthy food choices, being active physically for something like 30 minutes a day is recommended, limiting alcohol intake to 2 drinks a day, and controlling arterial fibrillation or irregular heartbeat. So all of those things can contribute to reducing our blood pressure, and basically the message is to lower your blood pressure, to lower your risk of having a stroke. So that's a very important message. And the important thing here, of course, is if you can lower your blood pressure, you lowered your risk of having a heart attack, you've lowered your risk of having a stroke, you've lowered your risk of having diabetes and dementia. So all of these things relate back to basically health of your heart. So that is the one thing you can do to improve your health as we get older, is to monitor your blood pressure and make sure we keep that under control. Now the other thing that's been added to this recently is salt. Australians on average eat about 4 grams of salt a day, eat about 9 grams of salt a day, which is about a tablespoon of salt. The recommended daily intake is about a teaspoon of salt. And so generally the message here is be aware of what salt you're taking in your diet. If possible, avoid putting extra salt on your food. Generally when we cook, there's enough salt in what we're cooking that we don't need to add extra salt. And try and avoid either use salt to cook or put it on your food, but don't do both. And if you can reduce the salt intake, once again that reduces hardening of the arteries and lowers your blood pressure, lowers your risk of stroke. So that's another very important message that they can keep in mind. There's a form that you'll find at the stroke outside here, which is about knowing your stroke risk. And this is what they call absolute risk. So it's the risk of basically having a heart attack. And the form, we can get the form outside, but basically what it is, it's a checklist of things that we've just been through. You know, how much you drink in alcohol a day, how much exercise you get, eat, etc. The good thing about this little checklist, I think, is they're all yes/no answers. So it's a bit hard to cheat on it. You've either got to answer yes or no to each of those questions. And if it's yes to more than 2 of them, that's strongly recommended you go to see your GP, get that checked out and let the GP make the recommendations. So how do we actually reduce, what do we do if somebody's having a stroke, and how do we recognise a stroke? The Stroke Foundation pushed this acronym FAST. And FAST just simply stands for face, arms, speech and time. So I'll just go through each of those very briefly. So face, and these are all things that come on suddenly. So there are other things that can cause these problems, but they tend to come on over a long period of time. If these things happen very suddenly, then it's a strong indication that it might be a stroke. Firstly, the face. If one side of the face drops, or both sides, all of a sudden, so one day you're fine, the next day you're not, that's something that's a big warning that it might be a stroke. In my case, for example, my face dropped a lot after the operation for about 6 months, but sort of after that it improved. But Karen notices that when I get tired, I still go back to the way I was. So you often have these sort of longer term impacts. Arms. Can you lift both arms? And that's a good example of an arm that doesn't work. In my case, the arm hasn't come back at all. And so as my son said, did you hear about the man who lost all the use of his left arm? He's all right now. So once again, it's differences between arms and something that usually will come on fairly suddenly. That's a warning that it might be a stroke. As I said again, there are other things that can cause this. But you know, the best thing is to let your doctor make that assessment. Don't try and self-diagnose. Speech, if your speech is suddenly slurred, or if you can't hear what's being said, or you can't make yourself understood when you're talking, or you find somebody else that you're talking to has the same impacts, then that's a strong indication that it might be a stroke. In all cases, the message is very simple. Ring 000 and get the ambulance to come, let them make the assessment, and usually they'll take you to hospital, and then there's various treatments that can be given. They say that an area of the brain dies of the size of a pea roughly every 12 minutes after you've had a stroke. So if you go on too long, you know, the impact on the brain gets bigger and bigger. And so another question is, what do you do while you're waiting for the ambulance? And the message is, don't give them anything to eat, don't give them anything to drink, lie them on the side in a coma position, and of course if they're having trouble breathing, well then you deliver CPR to do that. But the main message is just get the ambulance as quickly as you possibly can, get them off to hospital. Okay, they say there's a window of about 4.5 hours after a stroke, where if medication is given, then the long-term impacts are quite small. If it goes beyond that period of time, then you can have much more impacts permanently. So medication can be given in hospital to reduce the impacts. So that's the fast message. So just finishing up, there is a very good website, strokefoundation.com.au. There's a massive amount of information on that website. And there is also a number you can ring, 1800 787 653, and there's somebody there who can take calls and answer any questions of a more medical nature. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you took those key messages away.